It's an honor to present a talk about this sensitive topic on the psychological aspects of torture. When Basil asked me to talk about the psychological aspects of torture, he said, Rajat, can you talk about the permanent aspects of torture? So my instinctive reaction was that almost all aspects of torture are permanent. There is hardly anything which is temporary. All researches, all findings show that all aspects of the impact of torture is almost permanent. Now, as I'm going to talk about the psychological aspects of torture, maybe I should share an example that I have spoken at a number of meetings across the world. If we ask ourselves the question, what is torture? How does torture affect us? Maybe let us imagine two scenarios. Imagine that you are the one who's going through it. In the first instance, you have, say, a tornado or a cyclone which comes and hits you, and you suffer multiple injuries. Your bones get broken, your home is razed to the ground, your family suffers grievous injuries. That's the first scenario in which say either a cyclone or a tornado or any force, any catastrophe comes and does that to you. That's the first scenario. Now let us imagine a second scenario in which a group of policemen pick you up from your home, take you over, beat you up, inflict damages to you, break your bones, torture your family, and raze your home to the ground. In both the scenarios, the end result is the same. The damage that your body has suffered, the damage that your family has suffered, your home has been razed to the ground. These are two similar scenarios. I have asked groups of people across the world that the end result being the same, what do you see as the difference? And it's no surprise that all over the world, and I've had this example in almost 22 countries so far, the answer is always the same. In the first, people say that it is nature, it's the force of nature. And the second, they always say it is personal. So the end result being the same, one is personal and the other is force of nature. Now, if we ask ourselves that, okay, why is it that people talk of it, why is it that one affects a person so much and the other doesn't? If we see that if the end results remain the same, why should the second scenario affect ourselves so much? If the same number of bones are broken, if the same number of damages to your family, to your home has been razed, why should the second affect us so much? The answer from all over the world is, from different countries, from different cultures, from different groups, is that it's a violation. I feel angry when someone does that to me. But we don't say that we feel angry with the tornado. We don't say we feel angry with the typhoon. We don't say that we feel angry with so-and-so. But we say, I feel angry with the person who did this to me, right? So that is the first and most important aspect of torture. Torture is something which is intensely personal. Torture is something that does something to us that violates us. Now, if we have to understand torture, where do we have to begin from? We have to begin from what we say in psychiatry, interpersonal violence or interpersonal aggression. We have to understand aggression, we have to understand violence in terms of understanding torture. Okay. Torture, as we know, has been there for as long as human civilization has existed, for almost 5,000 years. But it is only in the last 30 or 40 years that psychiatry has turned its attention to torture. We have started understanding how torture happens, its impact on our psyche, what it does to the society, and what we are discovering slowly and steadily through the researches is It's shocking. It's simply shocking to see what torture does to ourselves, to our minds, to the generations which suffer even though they may not have gone through torture directly. Okay. Why it is shocking? Because it shows to us that under torture, the brain, the human brain, goes through a completely different spiral than it goes through when dealing with a normal situation, normal circumstances. Under torture, our brain, major parts of our brain stop functioning. Under torture, it's only the primitive aspects of our brain, as we call, which is involved with survival. They start operating and they become functional, and they remain in operation for the rest of their life. The logical, more cognitive, more abstract parts of the brain are no longer as much in operation as the other parts of the brain. Maybe let me share a story with you. I was dealing with someone who was a victim of sexual assault, and this is something that she shared with me. We all know that when somebody goes through a trauma, which is the byproduct of torture, something happens to our brain that is almost permanent. One of them is that we fail to pick up cues in the environment. That is the reason that if somebody is traumatized once, the chances that they will be traumatized again rises by almost 50%. That is, that if a woman is sexually assaulted, the chances that she will get sexually assaulted again is almost 40 to 50% higher than a woman who is not. It is simply because they don't pick up the cues. They don't pick up the danger signals in the environment that something is approaching. And that is something that also happens to us under torture. The brain stops picking up signals in the environment that danger is present. On the contrary, we miss out the signals which say our brains can pick up much more easily. This example which I think which just came to my mind when I was preparing for this talk. She was walking along the street, and let me say that her background is that she is around 30, very attractive, very bright, has been a victim of a brutal sexual assault, and she has picked up some of the threats of her life. So she was walking along the street. Suddenly a man comes over and he grabs her and drives her to the alley. He's about to sexually assault her when the police just burst on the scene. They were chasing this man. They drag him aside, and one of the police officers, he goes to her and says, "Ma'am, I hope you're okay. We were zeroing on this man. He was behaving very suspiciously, and we saw that he was somewhere acting in a way which aroused our suspicion. So we followed him, and then we saw that he was trying to follow you, and you are not aware of it. So we said, okay, let us see if we can catch him, if he does something." So we are so glad that we have caught hold of him, and we have done him. But you are safe. You are perfectly fine. And this woman, she was someone who was my patient. She said, you know, when all the while the police people were talking, saying that, "Ma'am, we have saved you, you're fine," my mind was not registering. Okay, I said, "What was happening to your mind?" She said, "What I was thinking of in my mind was that I'm not responsible for that. I did not create this rape." So I said, "Okay, did you think that that is what you have created every time?" She said, "Yes. Every time I have gone through a sexual assault, every time I have gone through abuse, I have felt I'm responsible for it. But when these policemen were sitting on both my sides and telling me that you are not responsible, it is as if something broke within me, and I realized, okay, I'm not responsible for what this man did to me. It is not my responsibility, it is not my fault." And in that moment, I felt free and liberated. Now, this is also what happens to many torture victims inside. This is a classical position that torture victims take. I'm responsible for the torture. Something which I did something which I contributed to, the perpetrator assaulted me, and therefore I brought it upon myself, right? And the therapy of the torture victims goes in first telling them, no, you are not responsible for the torture inflicted upon you. It's the perpetrator, it's the state, it is the person who did that, who did this to you. You are not responsible for that. So why is it that under torture we start believing that I'm responsible for it and not the other person? Because it has been seen through studies that when the perpetrator is torturing, and I mean torture in any form, they tell the victim that, and they don't tell it in so many words, they tell it both subtly and both in words, that you contributed to it, you brought yourself over here, you are responsible, I'm not responsible. And studies with perpetrators of torture again and again brings this up. They do not claim responsibility for torture. They don't even see it as torture. They see it as something legitimate, something morally right, that they need to do in order to take information from the person, or that they are doing this because somewhere it was something that was mandated to them. But in talking to countless police officers who have committed torture, I have not heard a single one say that he committed torture. They don't believe that. Right? What they believe is that it is not torture, it is something normal, and it is the victim or the survivor himself who caused. And this is the burden that the survivor carries within himself or herself for the rest of their life. And therapy goes in convincing the person that no, it is not you who are responsible for it, it is the perpetrator. Maybe let's take the scenario of torture one step further. Okay? What happens to us under torture? For a long time it was believed, and even I, in many of the lectures, when I would ask people that what is trauma, what is torture, I remember one police officer, a very senior officer, when I asked him that what is trauma, he answered that if you loudly scream and shout, that is trauma, that is torture, right? It was only 15 years back, but all over the world, studies show that people who undergo torture don't scream and shout. Very few of them, in fact, scream and shout. What do most of them do? Most of them actually freeze. If we see, most of them, their brain, it freezes because it feels that it can no longer cope up with the situation. Some time back, there was a very well-known experiment done in United States. It was done by somebody called Dr. Gallup. He was a student in clinical psychology. He showed his professor a very interesting phenomena. He took a chicken and he caught hold of the chicken and he dragged the chicken and pushed the chicken on the table. After some time, the chicken became still and lied quiet. Even when he took his hand off, the chicken did not move, right? Now he was interested in this phenomena. He said, I have taken my hand off, but the chicken is lying still. The chicken is not moving. How many animals, how many species would actually follow this behavior? To his surprise, the study showed that almost all the animals in some way or other show freezing behavior when they are accosted with danger, when they are accosted with an overwhelming stimuli. He got very interested in this. He said, do human beings also show this behavior? And as he studied this in different cultures and phenomena, he found the same thing. He found that when faced with trauma, human beings also freeze. Most of the human beings, when faced with trauma, do not go ahead or scream or shout or try to move away from the situation. They simply get rooted to the point. This discovery had very important repercussions for courts. Earlier, it was believed in psychiatry in what's famously known as the fight or flight syndrome, that faced with a danger, we either fight or we run away, right? And I remember that in textbook of psychiatry, Kaplan and Sadok, till 80s, flight and flight was written as the major symptom, the major coping mechanism with which we deal with overwhelming symptoms. But it is no longer true. It is no longer fight or flight. It is more to do with that when faced with overwhelming symptoms, we just freeze at a point. Imagine a vehicle going at a very fast pace through a jungle. An animal comes in front. What does the animal do? The animal freezes. Animal just stops, right? Very few times the animal would move away. Our brain, when faced with torture, behaves exactly like that. It freezes. It just stays there, unable to respond, unable to recall, till we are able to gather ourselves and run away again. Now, is this a survival mechanism or is this an avoidance mechanism? Answer is, it's a survival mechanism. In 9/11, studies were done to see in the terrorist attack who survived most and who doesn't. What they found was something very interesting, and the study was done with almost a few thousand people. Many of my colleagues were involved in that. They took detailed notes and instructions from people about how they behaved when the aeroplane struck the Twin Tower. Okay? There were different kinds of responses shown. One response was of people who got into the quick mode and said, okay, let's get out of here and let's run, let's do this, let's do that. The other group, they said we froze for a moment and said, oh my God, this is something terrible which is happening. They quickly took on the mobile and called their loved ones and said, look, there is attack. I may not survive, there is danger, but I'll try to do something. And the third group was who stood there calmly for 1 second, decided what to do, and then walked through. In which group was survival the highest? The last group. The last group showed the highest degree of survival. The people who tried to run and get out of that situation as quickly as possible, the survival rate in that group was the lowest. Okay? So what is important to keep in mind is that the brain studies show today that it is our brain, when faced with overwhelming stimuli, when faced with overwhelming situation, at first try to gauge what is happening around me and then take charge of the situation and then tries to go ahead and devise a plan. The chances of escape, the chances of getting away, the chances of survival in that situation are the highest. This has very important repercussions, implications for torture survivors, for people who are faced with overwhelming situations in life, for how to escape, how to move away from that situation. I have been in situations where torture has taken place. The first time when I was in a situation where torture took place, I still carry a guilt that comes in between. Why couldn't I stop it? I've discussed this with my professor. The answer to that is very simple. I froze during those moments. I was in a prison, and a group of prison officials whom I was accompanying assaulted a man whom they thought was responsible for some terrorist act and who was trying to pass a message. Within seconds, they pounced upon him, they jumped upon him and tried to beat him up. They put him on the ground and started hitting him. It took me almost 20 seconds before I realized that, okay, someone is being beaten and someone is being tortured. And then I went to the person, I said, will you stop that, please? And he just gently pushed me aside and he said, you stay out of it, this is our department. I'm talking of one of the most notorious prisons in Delhi, Tihar, where I have worked for almost 20 years. They pushed me aside and they said, well, you stay out of it. And before me, before my horrified eyes, I would say that they beat that man to a pulp to find out what he was trying to convey. Did he convey? No, he did not. Right? He did not convey what they were expecting him to convey. What I realized from that situation, and what is somewhere true of all torture phenomena, is that when in torture there are three agents involved. One is whom we call the perpetrator, who beats, the person who inflicts torture. One is the victim, the one who's being beaten. Is there a third agent? Yes. The third agent is, he's called a bystander. The someone who stands on the side and witnesses it. I was a bystander. Now, what is the impact of all three? Let me just elaborate on that. So when we talk about the psychological impact of torture, we are talking of three agents over here: the victim, the perpetrator, and the bystander. Is the effect on all three different? Yes, but only slightly. It's only a matter of degree that it is different. How are bystanders affected? Bystanders are affected because they also feel that somewhere it is a phenomena that could happen to them. So, using psychological studies, it has been seen that on a scale of 0 to 10, if the victim suffers atrocity and you rate it as 9, then the bystanders who are standing around or who are hearing about it would also get affected to a degree of almost 6 to 7, which means that you are getting affected. And in several studies done by Israeli psychologists, it has been seen that with one person who has been tortured, there are around 30 to 35 people around him who would get seriously affected to the level of 6.5 to 7. Which means that if you torture one person, you are actually affecting a large group. You are not just affecting a single individual. Earlier it was believed that when we torture somebody, we are affecting a single individual. No, it's not. We are affecting a large group. Interpersonal violence is just like that. One of the questions which is very often asked is that, is interpersonal violence really that bad? Somebody asked me in that, do you think that interpersonal violence causes that much effect? I said, yes. One serial killer can change the behavior of a whole city. That's the impact of interpersonal violence in our lives. Today, one serial killer can change the behavior of a whole city. We had in Delhi some time back a serial killer who was caught. Within a week, the entire behavior of the city changed. Had they seen that? No, they had only heard about him. It's the same thing with torture. When you hear about torture, when you witness torture, when you see it in front of you, it affects you, it affects your brain, it affects the plasticity of the brain in fundamental ways. Does it only affect us? No, it also affects children. How? Maybe I can share 2 examples. I have a 7-year-old daughter. Some of you may have seen, she was here today. She came with me to the office, to Asian Human Rights Commission. In front of my desk, there is a poster, "Stop Torture." So she read that and she asked me that, what is torture? I said, okay, how do I explain torture to a 7-year-old? So I said, torture is, when police beat up a young person and they try to take information. So I was wondering how to go ahead further. She stopped me. She says, oh, that's boring. I don't want to hear that. I know about it. So I said, what do you know about it? She said, yeah, we play torture. I said, what do you mean you play torture? She said, well, in our school, boys and girls, when we want to know something from someone, we play torture. We just catch hold of the person like this or this, and we say, okay, you tell me. So I say, oh my God, where did you learn that? She said, well, I learned it on television, I have heard it, I have seen it in movies, I have seen it everywhere. So I said, well, I felt, what should I do first? Now, should I be a parent? Should I go ahead and give her a whole lot of information? I say, that is not the way you take out information from people. Now, this was her turn to get surprised. You mean that's not the way you take information from people? I said, no. You have dialogue with people, you talk with people in order to take out information. She says, oh, I did not know that. I thought this is the way you take out information. Now, I still have to go ahead and talk to her and explain this, right?
She's a perpetrator.
So, you're absolutely right. So, today, by watching this, by watching what has happening in terms of people beating, we are also conditioning our children in order to become violent, and through whether it's whether through corporal punishment or whether through numerous ways in which they witness violence and torture on television, on media, they are learning that torture is a normal way of life. It is the way we find out information, and this is something which needs to be stopped. Maybe let me give you another example. I have a German psychologist, a very close friend of mine. Several years back, when Abu Ghraib happened, she was shocked to find that she's getting cases of children who are playing Abu Ghraib, the prison situation. She found that children, when they watched it on television, they are doing it to each other. And what is it that they are getting out of it? She said, if you watch those children doing that, you would notice them that they are excited. They are feeling that, okay, this is something which is giving them a high. And her question was, how do we stop it? Right? So, when we carry out torture in our midst, we are affecting the whole society, the whole community. We are not letting it immune. And that, to me, is an extremely dangerous portent for the coming century. I think it's important to discriminate between that there is nothing called a good torture, there is nothing called a good beating, and there is nothing called a bad beating. Anytime you violate a person, anytime you do something without a person's permission, when you touch their body, when you try to do something their body, it is wrong, and the effect stays upon it for a long time, for your lifetime. So this is what torture does to us. Torture does to our bodies, to our personalities. Okay. Well, a few more things, and I would stop, and then we can have question answers. Torture affects our memory. We have two kinds of memory. One is called normal memory, and other is called traumatic memory. Under torture, the memory that we have, it fragments. It is no longer a normal memory that we are carrying. Now, when we ask torture victims, what happened to you? In those moments, could you describe to me what happened? One of the difficulties as mental health workers we note is that they have a difficulty describing torture. In a famous experiment that was done, and since I'm a psychologist, I turn back to experiments and researchers to share what gone through. A group of students, literature students, from some of the best universities of United States were taken for this experiment. They were shown a clip which showed torture, which showed a man beating another man for full 10 minutes. After that, they were asked to describe the torture in their own words. There were a group of around 20 students who were given this, people who had very high literary skills, whose writing skills were excellent. What do you think came out of that experiment? What came out was something amazing. None of the students could easily describe the phenomena of torture. What they simply wrote was that this person beat him up, this person was beaten up badly, and this person went through this, and that's it. Okay. Now, after that, what the people who were conducting the experiment, they had hoped that the subjects, the finest literary students in America would be able to describe the torture in graphic, eloquent terms. None of them could do that. It was just a simple reductionistic, one paragraph saying they did this, they faced this, and therefore it ended. It was not even more than a paragraph. Now, when the whole description was put in front of them, the description ran like this. This person was beaten up, there was blood on his face, there was acrid smell of things inside his mouth, his bones showed signs of being cracked. All those things the students had missed. When it was asked of them that why is it that all these things, including the loud sounds which were there on the in the torture chamber, including the pain that they were describing, the screaming that they were describing. You had described none of that. All of them said that somewhere we did not register it. Somewhere they said that watching that, it is as if we had started blanking ourselves out and we were not noticing that anymore. So at the end of it, when this exercise was given, we were glad to write, this happened, this happened, this happened, and then we were glad to get away from that. So this is what torture does to us. It makes us blank out. It makes us what we call having a tunnel vision. A tunnel vision is like if, for example, I were to see this room through this tunnel, I can only see what I can see out of this. Torture is just like that. Going through torture, witnessing torture, just fragments my mind in such a way that I'm not able to register the whole of my environment. I'm able to register only a very small part of the environment. Right? Overwhelming stimulus like torture does that to us. I can share an example that I went through. Nearly 20 years ago, I was in the United States and I was mugged. There were 3 people who mugged me. That was on the streets of San Francisco. It was at a conference and I was taking a walk outside after the conference was over. Ironically, it was a conference on clinical psychology and the topic was forensic sciences. It was too heavy. I decided to take a walk. I didn't realize that I walked into a street which is one of the most notorious streets over there. Well, suddenly I found myself accosted by 3 young men. One of them shoved a knife over here and the other said, okay, what do you have? So I looked, I just had a purse. I didn't have much money, must have been around $70, $80. So he took out and he saw that there was no money. He got very angry. Now, you're supposed to protect yourself at that time. So I was saying that, look, don't hit me further. Take this. I'm sure you'll find more money elsewhere. I'm here at a conference. I don't have money. So they gave me a jab and they say, okay, get lost. They threw the purse down. I picked it up. I rushed back to the hotel. We called the police. They came over to take my testimony. The policeman asked me, what do you do? And I said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with criminals. And so he says, Doc, it must be very easy for you to then give the details of the whole thing. So I said, yeah, I was still shaking. So for full 20 minutes to 25 minutes, I remember I could not tell them anything. I could not recall anything. All I could recall was the knife that they had kept over here and the handle that I could see like this, nothing else, right? That is what is traumatic memory. In traumatic memory, you're fragmented and you can only see a very small part of what is around you, not the whole. So I could not recall also anything more than the handle that I was seeing like this, that they had pressed against me. I could not recall their faces. I could not recall the clothes they were wearing, which I thought would be easy for me because that is what I'm dealing with. I'm making reports on situations which are highly disturbing, highly traumatic, and I was someone who used to take pride on the details that I was noting. But here, in a situation where I was the survivor, I could not do so. That is what traumatic memory is about. Traumatic memory reduces us to not note what is happening in the rest of the environment. It is, in principle, it is very simple. It has been seen that traumatic memory is what we call somatic memory. Your body registers the trauma even though your brain may not, right? So you ask the person to focus on the body, not the brain. Okay, what is your hand feeling? What are you experiencing, the different sensations? And as we amplify those sensations, the brain is finally able to go back and create that into a whole memory that the person can put into a narrative which they can say as to what happened during those moments when they suffered trauma and torture, right? So today we have a situation where the research on torture, research on trauma is leading us to new grounds, and it is also creating a new science of trauma survivors, which helps them to testify more effectively in courts, which helps them to feel motivated and which helps them to come up more strongly as to what happened with them and narrate the incident that has taken place. So the coming century, I'm sure, would lead us to understand more truths about torture, about trauma, and leads to a more scientific and objective understanding of the whole reality. So with that, I come to an end, and we can put ourselves to question and answers.